Hi team, this is Module 7B, Chapter 13, the Peripheral Nervous System, or PNS. This is the second video for the Peripheral Nervous System, and this is about sensory integration. So just a quick review, we did Central Nervous System, let me get my pen first. We did Central Nervous System in Chapter 12, now Chapter 13 is the Peripheral Nervous System, and there's many pieces to the peripheral nervous system, but here I show there's a sensory afferent division to the PNS, and there's a motor efferent division to the PNS. The sensory afferent division is a sensory division, so there are somatic afferent, sensory afferent neurons. That's coming from sensing things from the skin and skeletal muscle and joints. So that's this cartoon down here shows the blue is the sensory afferent neuron coming in from the skin, but it could also show this cartoon sensory afferent information coming in from a skeletal muscle or the joint or a joint. So there's the sensory afferent division, the somatic, which includes somatic afferent, sensory afferent neurons, and visceral sensory afferent neurons coming from the viscera. So your heart, your lungs, your intestines, etc. Then the next branch of the peripheral nervous system, or major branch, is the motor efferent division, and that would include somatic motor efferent neurons coming from the but going to the muscle, and visceral efferent motor neurons going to the viscera, like the heart and the lungs. And then we did these questions last time, so hopefully you can answer those. Give it a shot. We did this last video as well. This is a cartoon of a first order sensory neuron with free nerve endings. Remember, in the sensory afferent division, you have a first order, second order, and third order sensory neurons that get information to the cerebral cortex so that you can sense what you're sensing. In this case, in this cartoon, there's a cold stimulus, and this whole cartoon would be a sensory afferent neuron. Here's the free nerve endings. I don't like that they call it nerve endings, but these are the dendrites of the sensory afferent neuron. Here's the cell body of the sensory afferent neuron, and here's the axon terminal of the sensory afferent neuron that would terminate in the spinal cord. So something's cold, these free endings, dendrites, would detect that cold stimulus. They would initiate a generator potential. So a generator potential is a type of graded potential, and we've talked about that. So if the resting membrane here of this dendrite, let's say is minus 70 millivolts, the generator potential, so this cold stimulus would cause sodium ions to rush into the cell, and the generator potential might get to minus 60 millivolts. If it does that, then it can fire an action potential in the axon here of the first order sensory afferent neuron, take that information to the spinal cord and then up to the brain. And then you go, whoa, this is cold. And this is another cartoon that we've looked at in the previous video. So this is still a review. This just shows a first order sensory afferent neurons, temperature receptors in the foot, and here's a match. Here's pain receptors in the hand, so they cut themselves on a piece of glass. The first order sensory afferent neurons go in to the spinal cord, and they cross over or decussate in the spinal cord, and then that information about pain or temperature will go up these tracts, because remember, if you're in the central nervous system, bundles of axons are called tracts. So these axons will travel up to the thalamus, where the second order neurons will synapse with the third order neurons, and then you get a sensation of pain or temperature. And this just gives the steps. So interesting here, different names for these generator potentials. So this generator potential in the cartoon here can also be called a receptor potential, but it's a type of graded potential. We talked about graded potentials and action potentials when we did an overview of the nervous system. But basically, this generator potential or receptor potential, it's a transmembrane potential, so transmembrane going across the plasma membrane of the dendrites here. It's produced by activation of a sensory receptor. So these free dendrite endings are the sensory receptors. And you produce this trace, so this is a generator potential or a receptor potential. You produce that trace by a process called sensory transduction. Sensory transduction is just a depolarizing event resulting from positive charges flowing inward. And when you do this, you're converting a sensory signal, in this case, a cold stimulus is a sensory signal, to an electrical signal. That's transduction. So now we're going to look at something new, sensory integration. This is processing information at 3 levels. So if we come over here at the bottom, you can process information at the receptor level. So that's a sensory reception and transmission to the central nervous system. So these would be examples of receptors. So these could be free nerve endings in the skin for pain, warmth, or cold. The receptors could be in your muscle spindles or in your joints. And then the second level, where you would process information about the world, is the circuit level. That's where you process information in ascending pathways. So when you move up the tracks, you're ascending, and you process information there. And then finally, at the third level, you process information about your world at the perceptual level, and you do that in the sensory cortex. So sensory input is relayed toward the brain, and it gets processed along the way. And processing will occur we just looked at the 3 levels, the receptor level, the circuit level, and the perceptual level. So at the receptor level, the processing is just sensing, using your receptors out here at the receptor level to sense things. And then at the circuit level, processing involves taking that information up to the thalamus. And then at the perceptual level, processing includes becoming aware of what you just sensed in your cerebral cortex. So at the receptor level, we'll start down here and go into a little more detail. So processing information at the receptor level, you have your sensory receptors respond to a specific stimuli, and they convert that stimulus information into a graded potential and then into an action potential. So for example, we just reviewed this in this video. If these were free nerve endings and there was a painful stimulus, like a piece of broken glass is a painful stimulus, pierces your skin, these free dendrites would respond to that painful stimulus by generating a graded potential here in the dendrites. But then if the stimulus is great enough, the pain is great enough, that graded potential here in the free nerve endings would be turned into an action potential, and then that action potential could take the information up to your brain. The action potential is sent along this first order neuron in the chain of 3 neurons, and that process can also be called transduction because you're converting energy into an electrical signal. So we're still going to talk about processing information at the receptor level, but there's 2 concepts about what sensory receptors can do. Sensory receptors can adapt to the stimuli. So just for example, if you had your shirt on all day, then you don't really notice that the shirt is touching your skin because your sensory receptors in your skin have adapted to that shirt being on your skin. So, and this is a cartoon of an adapting phasic receptor. So the stimulus is applied. So you put on your shirt in the morning and you feel it as you put it on. So these are the frequency of action potential. So this part of the graph shows the frequency of action potentials telling your brain that, oh, there's a shirt on my back. But then over time, the frequency of the action potentials decreases. You can see here the frequency has gone down. So your sensory receptors have adapted and you don't feel, you could feel your shirt if you think about it, but you don't feel it if you're not thinking about it. So in an adaptation, we're here at this bullet, some sensory receptors can adapt to stimuli. That just means there's a decrease in sensitivity of the receptor in response to that constant stimulus, like the shirt on your back. Phasic receptors can adapt. So when you first put on your shirt, like I said, you do a burst of action potentials, but then the action potential firing rate decreases. Phasic receptors include receptors for pressure, so that would be like the pressure of the shirt on your back. Phasic receptors include touch receptors, so like if you have a ring on, you don't sense that when you first put your ring on, you feel it, but then you don't feel it later on. And then smell. So that's kind of interesting. You probably know this. You can go into a room and go, oh, that smells terrible, and then 10 minutes later, you don't smell it anymore. It's because your receptors, your olfactory receptors, have adapted to the smell. Other types of sensory receptors cannot adapt. So the stimulus is applied here, like pain. The action potentials start firing at a certain rate here. And they keep firing at the same rate as long as the stimulus is there. And so, for example, pain, unfortunately, it'd be nice if pain didn't do that. It'd be nice if you could adapt to pain, but I guess some people can, and it depends on the level of the pain. So there's basically two types of, well, you can either, your sensory receptors can either adapt to the stimulus or they don't adapt to the stimulus. So now we look at processing, sensory integration and processing here at the circuit level. And this is a cartoon that I've shown you before. These are all different types of circuits. So for example, let's look at A. This is divergence. This is a circuit where you diverge, the neurons diverge, but they're in the same pathway. So here's your original neuron, here's the cell body, here's the axon, it splits, sends information to these neurons, and then their axons split, send information to these 4 neurons. But see how the arrows are all going the same way here? That means the circuit is diverging, so it's splitting, but it's going towards the same pathway because all the arrows are in the same direction down here in the cartoon. And then there's other circuits that you can look at, B, C, D, E, and F. This is just a cartoon to remind you that circuits are complex and they can work in a lot of different ways. But at the circuit level, that occurs at synapses between the first and second order neurons. So here's a synapse between a first and a second order neuron. Here's a synapse between a first and a second order neuron in the thalamus. And these circuit level processing occurs in the spinal cord, the brain stem. So this area is the brain stem. Here's the thalamus. And then the cerebellum is down here. So you can have circuit level processing of sensory information at these anatomical structures, spinal cord, brainstem, thalamus, and cerebellum. And then the circuits could look like any one of these guys. So this cartoon is all about circuits. So finally, the processing at the perceptual level occurs. It occurs in the sensory cortex. And so when you perceive something, that means you give meaning to the stimulus. So there's aspects of sensory perception. So there's perceptual detection. So that's just your ability to detect a stimulus, is one of the first steps in perceiving something. And then you can estimate how big that perception is. And the way your brain does that is using the intensity of, or the intensity of the stimulus is coded in the frequency of action potentials. So if you have a high frequency of action potentials arriving here in the cortical sensory center, then that would be a great, that would reflect a great stimulus. So for example, if you cut your finger versus if you cut your finger with a piece of glass versus if you cut your finger off, the magnitude of pain that would come from cutting your finger off would bring with it a higher frequency of action potentials. And then also the third aspect of sensory perception is spatial discrimination. So now at this level of processing, you're identifying exactly where the stimulus came from, and you can also look at how sensitive we are to different stimuli with the sensory homunculus. So remember that from last chapter. It shows like your mouth, your face, your fingertips are super sensitive. So they have a lot of sensory afferent neurons located there. So for example, perception of pain and sensory integration. Pain warns of tissue damage. Painful stimuli include extreme pressure, extreme temperature. You can also get pain from chemicals released from injured tissue. And then the sensory afferent neurons carrying pain action potentials will release this substance called substance P. It's a neurotransmitter at their synapse with the second order neurons. So for here, you would find release of, if in pain, you would find the release of the neurotransmitter substance P from the axon terminal of the second order neuron onto the cell body of the third order neuron. Referred pain, everybody's probably heard of that. If you're having a heart attack, then that pain can be referred in this cartoon to your left chest, basically the left side of your body. So your jaw and neck and your chest and down your left arm, you can refer heart pain to those areas. Let's see what else is kind of interesting. If you're having pain in the lungs or the diaphragm, that can be referred to the left and partially the right area of your cervical area. And that's, yeah, the gallbladder. So if you're having gallbladder pain, so it's kind of the area of your gallbladder, but it can also, that pain in your gallbladder can also be referred to your right shoulder.